Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here and welcome back to Final Fantasy XIV Versus. This series is dedicated towards discussing the pros and cons of each job within each role in Final Fantasy XIV. This video will be focusing on the tanks. Now just a reminder, I am going to pick a winner, but every job can do every content, no questions asked, so play whatever you enjoy. Also, I won't really bring up role actions unless there's some unique interaction that they have with a particular job, so you won't hear much about those. First up, let's start with the traditional sword and board tank, Paladin. As one of the two OG tanks for Final Fantasy XIV, the job has seen some weird ups and downs across its time. However, it has really hit a stride in the last couple of expansions, as it's moved further and further into this holy sword summoning machine. Bringing a mix of physical and magical attacks has given it versatility and a fantastic looking set of skills to match. But how's the job actually faring in Endwalker? I'd say it's faring quite well. It sees pretty consistent play across the board, though some of its optimizations for high-end players can be a little bit clunky. Now the job has two phases that it rotates between in combat. Their melee phase consists of several 3-combo skill chains with a few specific goals. The Goring Blade combo keeps a dot up on the boss, the Royal Authority combo grants 3 stacks of Sword Oath, and each of those stacks can be used on Atonement, a powerful global cooldown skill. These 3 stacks don't have to be used back to back to back, so more knowledgeable paladins can shift them around for more optimal play. Once a minute, paladins can use Requiescat to go into their spell phase. This grants them instant cast spells and increases the potency of their offensive ones. Holy Spirit is single target damage, and Holy Circle is AoE damage, while Clemency is a strong heal, even healing the paladin a bit if they heal somebody else with it instead. It also grants access to Confiteor, their finishing spell that ends the Requiescat phase with a huge AoE damage hit. All of the offensive spells also heal the paladin a bit, granting them great sustain during this time. Confiteor then grants access to a set of spell blades, Blade of Faith, Blade of Truth, and Blade of Valor. This combo deals high AoE damage, restores MP, heals the paladin, and eventually places a dot similar to Goring Blades at the end of the combo, though it's AoE, so it's better. The spell blades are also all instant cast and can be used from range, giving the paladin a large window of mobility, self-sustain, and damage across all of Requiescat through to Blade of Valor. After Blade of Valor ends, you go into a Royal Authority combo and repeat every minute. During the melee window, they also have a buff they can use to enhance their physical damage called Fight or Flight. Using this at the right time is essential for a strong melee combo leading into a powerful magic one. They also have a few physical off globals to use frequently. Expiation is AoE damage that restores some MP, Circle of Scorn is an AoE dot, and Intervene is a gap closer with some damage tied to it. Remember to use these frequently, but saving a charge of Intervene to help with certain movement or ensuring these skills also hit your Fight or Flight windows are very important. They of course have a basic AoE combo should the need arise, and they even have Shield Bash, a long duration stun that's on the global cooldown. It only sees use in niche situations, but can be a great tool to bring forth when needed in addition to their role action stun. The rest of their tools are defensive. First, their Oath Gauge grants access to a few defensive skills, each costing 50 gauge. You get a little bit of gauge every time you auto attack too, so you can pretty well time out when you'll actually have the gauge available. Holy Sheltron grants them 100% block rate and some healing over time, while also granting reduced incoming damage for the first few seconds. Intervention instead throws a slightly weaker version of these effects minus the block rate at a target teammate, enhanced further if you happen to have one of their defensive skills active. Great for assisting your second tank or even teammates being targeted by attacks. They can also use cover for 50 gauge, which causes them to take all the damage of their covered target while in range. However, this skill has seen reduced use outside of very specific circumstances, so the other two are much more frequently used than this. Now just to rattle off their remaining defensive skills, Sentinel reduces incoming damage by 30%, Divine Veil provides a shield to teammates if the paladin is healed during its effect, and it also restores some HP. Passage of Arms gives the paladin 100% block rate and reduces the damage of any teammates in the wings behind them by 15%. The skill is channeled though, so using any other action will interrupt it. Fortunately, by just popping it for a second, you can actually give your teammates the damage reduction for about 5 seconds, so it does have some flexible use. Finally, they have Hallowed Ground, their tank invulnerability skill as we'll call them throughout this video. And this one is quite literally that. It makes the paladin completely invincible to almost any attack for 10 seconds. These are all great skills that you'll definitely need to get a grasp on. Now for the pros, Paladin fits the traditional tank image, making it appealing to players who want to look like a holy protector. Job fantasy can be really important, and especially among the tanks, this one looks the most like a tank. It has a simple to understand flow with some room to min-max, lots of ranged attacks, and even a direct heal for their teammates. Don't be shy trying to save something with clemency, even if it isn't really what you're supposed to do when you're being quote-unquote optimal. And the sustain they have naturally during their magic phase combined with Holy Sheltron can really let themselves, pull themselves through situations for more dangerous attacks or big dungeon pulls. For the cons though, Paladin does have some clunky faults. Min-maxing on the job can be cumbersome depending on the fight since the rotation is incredibly rigid to maintain buff timings. They also lack significant burst tools and are often in the bottom 2 of tank DPS, but not by a whole lot. At most you see maybe 3 or 4%, and that varies with fight because some are more friendly to the Paladin. And despite seeming like they have decent numbers of defensive tools, they are often considered to be one of the less defensive tanks. This is due to their long hollowed ground timer and lack of powerful defensive tools elsewhere. This isn't to say they're squishy, they still have great team utility and they can definitely take as many hits as the other tanks, but you're gonna have to manage that gauge and make sure you're keeping track of your stronger cooldowns on top of that. Now despite any of the cons, the job fantasy and relatively close balancing of the tank role keeps Paladin in the game as much as any other tank out there. Now for OG tank number 2, Warrior. This job has also had quite the journey through the years. It started as arguably useless all the way back in 2.0, but since 2.1 has gradually improved and moved into this berserker tank fantasy. Not only do they have great defensive capabilities, but they also rip through enemies with massively powerful strikes, big numbers, big hits, you know what it is. This has been true for quite some expansions, but is that enough in Endwalker? Well, I'd say it's doing more than enough. Warrior is super popular thanks to its ease of play and its powerful job fantasy. During a fight, it first wants to make sure it's maintaining its Surging Tempest buff, granting it increased damage. So long as this is up, they shift over to prioritizing their Beast Gauge, which they want to generate in order to unleash powerful attacks. Fellcleave is a powerful single target attack, and Decimate is a powerful AoE attack. Now by using another skill, Infuriate, they instantly gain 50 Beast Gauge and transform these skills into more powerful versions, Inner Chaos for Fellcleave and Chaotic Cyclone for Decimate. These skills will also automatically critically direct hit, so there's always going to be big numbers associated with them. All of these skills also reduce Infuriate's cooldown, which lets you keep the numbers pumping. Now once a minute, warriors can enter Inner Release, and this is synonymous with their job fantasy. This reduces the cost of their next 3 Beast Gauge skills to 0 and ensures that they critically direct hit. It also grants access to Primal Rend, a massive AoE gap closer that also critically direct hits. They also can't be knocked back or CC'd for the most part during this, which is really awesome sometimes, and sometimes can actually screw the mechanics up, so be a little bit careful with the timing. This Inner Release window and Infuriate are both part of their big damage burst, but ensure to never use Infuriate while under Inner Release. It's basically wasting a critical direct hit since you're already going to get that under Inner Release anyway. Now between this, they do have some off globals to use. Upheaval and Orogeny are just single target and AoE OGCDs respectively, but ones that actually share a cooldown. Onslaught is a gap closer with 3 hole charges, something that only Warrior gets with its gap closer, and you can use those for damage or save them for movement reliant mechanics. They also of course have an AoE combo, but that's run of the mill stuff. Now as for defensive capabilities, Warrior is absolutely stacked. Thrill of Battle increases max HP and heals them for the same amount, while also increasing healing the Warrior receives for its duration. Vengeance reduces damage by 30% and even deals damage back to enemies that strike them while they're under the effect. Equilibrium restores a large chunk of health and even heals the warrior over time for a short period after. Shake It Off is a party-wide shield that also heals everyone it hits, and you can even make it stronger by sacrificing your other defensive buffs for more powerful team AoEs. However, I think the cooldown that most people know Warrior best for is Bloodwetting. This reduces incoming damage, grants a small HP shield to the warrior, and allows the warrior to heal for every enemy they hit with a weapon skill for a short duration. The damage reduction is also even greater for the first few seconds. This skill can single-handedly allow warriors to survive even the most absurd situations, as the healing is nigh unmatched in AoE packs and consistently present in single target encounters. You can even give a lot of these effects to a nearby party member by using Nascent Flash. This ability shares a cooldown with Bloodwetting, but is more apt for situations where you just don't need all of those effects on yourself and somebody else would benefit from them more. But even more importantly, if you land weapon skills with Nascent Flash, you'll actually heal not only yourself as the warrior, but also the teammate you've given that effect to. So it's just such an insanely strong skill. So it doesn't matter that they share a cooldown because they're just that good. You just have to use the right one at the right time. Finally, they have their tank invulnerability skill, Holmgang. This prevents the warrior from falling below 1 HP for 10 seconds to most attacks, and even binds weaker enemies in place. While you still take damage during this skill, the inability to die is key here. So long as you don't die right after the 10 seconds have passed, you just have 10 seconds of not being able to die. That is pretty much as good as anything's gonna be for an invulnerability skill. Not to mention, the skill actually has a pretty short cooldown of only 4 minutes, so it can be used a lot in longer encounters to skip or abuse lots of tank mechanics or specific other attacks as well. So the pros for Warrior. The biggest pro is that it's super easy to pick up and play. If you've never tanked, this is probably your best pick. Its burst damage is insanely high, and its job fantasy makes you feel really strong during those 1-minute burst windows. These strict burst timings also give them an edge in fights with long downtime phases, essentially allowing them to chain them back to back when the boss is available. Not to mention their sustain and defensive capabilities make them one of the best actual tanks in the game, this whole berserker fantasy aside. For the cons, most are kind of preferential, which is really good for the job. Some people find the 1-minute burst windows and spamming 1 or 2 skills kinda boring, even if the number is big. Their involvement outside of those 1-minute burst windows isn't exactly engaging either. And despite all the big numbers, Warrior's overall damage compared to the other tanks largely relies on fight design. If it has lots of downtime breaks like I mentioned earlier, its value goes up. 100% uptime encounters definitely favor other tanks more often, but again, it's only by a super small percentage. Either way, if you're looking for a tank that lets you let loose that monkey brain hee-hee-hoo-ha big numbers, this is the best choice for you. Now onto one of our newer options, let's check out Dark Knight. I say newer despite Dark Knight's introduction in 3.0, just an expansion later, but it's been so constantly poked and prodded and adjusted that it might as well be unidentifiable to what it was back then. Despite this, it maintains some of its identity as a busy, high-bursting tank with a big sword. Does that stack up against what our other tanks bring to the table though? Let me tell you, it sure does. Dark Knight may be criticized for its design over the years, but its performance in high-end content speaks for itself. A main portion of its job identity that it's maintained is its ability to use its MP to provide a number of effects. Nowadays, it's used for some damage and defensive tools. On top of that, it does have another resource called Blood, which will also allow them to execute specific attacks. For the cost of 3000 MP, they can use one of 3 skills: Edge of Shadow for big single target damage, Flood of Shadow for big AoE damage, and the Blackest Night, a large max health shield that can be placed on any party member for a short time. The shield being broken grants the Dark Knight the Dark Arts effect, making the next Edge or Flood free. It is essential that anytime you use the Blackest Night that it is broken, because otherwise you do suffer a DPS loss. Edge and Flood also grant the Dark Knight bonus damage for a time, so using them just enough to maintain that buff, but not too much that you can't utilize the Blackest Night when you need it, or deal lots of damage in burst windows is essential. They also gain Blood as they use their basic combos and abilities. For the cost of 50 Blood, they can use Blood Spiller for single target damage, Quietus for AoE damage, or Living Shadow. The Living Shadow summons a dark clone of a familiar Dark Knight NPC to automatically attack your opponent. This has a long cooldown, so you'll be using it as part of your 2-minute burst windows. Now they do have even more attacks to assist their damage and utility as well. Plunge is their gap closer that holds up to 2 charges. Salted Earth is an AoE that Dark Knights drop at their feet that deals damage to anything standing in it over time. You can also execute Salt and Darkness at the higher levels, causing a highly damaging AoE explosion from within your Salted Earth. Then you have Carven Spit and Abyssal Drain, 2 skills that share a cooldown. Carven Spit deals high off-global damage to a single target and restores some MP, while Abyssal Drain deals AoE damage, restores MP, and even restores HP for each target hit. Abyssal Drain is best used on large groups of enemies, otherwise you'll be using Carven Spit mostly. Their final attack skill is Shadowbringer, fitting right, which deals huge off-global damage. It stores up to 2 charges at 60 seconds a charge, so saving up 2 of them for your big 2-minute burst window is a frequently used plan. However, a charge can be used early if a fight mechanic dictates its necessity, such as bursting something with really low HP. Now, while those are all of the job's attacks, it also has cooldowns in addition to those attacks. Blood Weapon grants 5 stacks of the Blood Weapon buff. Each weapon skill or spell used consumes a stack and restores some MP and grants some blood. With a 60-second cooldown, it becomes a big part of their 1 and 2 minute burst windows, especially for that bonus MP and blood. Finally, they have Delirium. This causes the next 3 Blood Spiller or Quietus uses to cost no blood and also restore some MP. Also with a 2-minute cooldown, you can see why the job is so busy and powerful during its burst windows. Oh right, by the way, this job is a tank, yeah? Well, let's see what tank skills it has too, I suppose. Shadow Wall reduces damage taken by 30% for a short time. Dark Mind reduces magic damage taken by 20% for a short time. Oblation is a 10% damage reduction skill you can use either on yourself or a party member. It even has 2 charges with a 60-second charge time. Then there's Dark Missionary, which reduces magic damage taken by the party for a short time by 10%. We already mentioned the Blackest Night, so let's move over to another really big skill for them, Living Dead. This is their tank invulnerability equivalent, and it is one that has been a roller coaster of emotion. Upon activation, the Dark Knight is granted Living Dead for 10 seconds. Now this buff does nothing by itself, but if the Dark Knight takes lethal damage during that time, it will trigger the Walking Dead effect and preserve their life for 10 seconds after. However, if the Dark Knight isn't healed for an amount equal to 100% of their max health in that 10-second window, they will die. Fortunately, nowadays, Dark Knight actually heals themselves with their own global cooldowns once Walking Dead is procced, something that is much newer for the job. They can heal themselves to full off this most of the time, but if Walking Dead was triggered on a bad GCD timing, then you might need like an OGCD from a healer in order to ensure safety. So for the pros, the job's burst damage is insanely high. While this tapers off between burst windows, you will feel very powerful during this time, even more so in encounters with lots of downtime. It's also insanely busy during burst windows, in exchange for being semi-calm between them. It has quite a few unique tools for reducing magic damage, a very potent shield in that of the Blackest Night, and an overall solid array of defensive and offensive skills. It truly does feel like a DPS that they just decided to make a tank, as most people would often say with Dark Knight as a whole. The cons, on the other hand, are noticeable as well. For one, it's so busy during burst windows that if you have to do any tank-related responsibilities during that time, it can be a hassle. Whether it's using a tank cooldown or repositioning, you just expect pain. Also, having magic-only defensive tools can leave you sometimes feeling vulnerable to certain bosses that use less magical skills. They've gotten a lot better about making most bosses use magical skills in recent times, but a pure physical boss sometimes slips through now and again. And of course, the most noticeable con is their lack of health sustain. Their 1-2-3 combo has a bit of healing off the 3rd skill, as does Abyssal Drain, but that's pretty much it. This makes them have to mitigate much smarter, especially in more casual content like dungeons, whereas you'll see Warrior practically solo heal themselves and maybe even somebody else if they're timing their skills correctly. The other 2 tanks also do a pretty good job of sustaining, so it really just leaves Dark Knight hanging dry. Despite some pretty obvious flaws though, the job frequents endgame raids and is considered a powerhouse in endgame content. Finally, we come to the most recent tank on the list, Gunbreaker. The job was added in Shadowbringers and joins Dark Knight in the "oh right, I'm playing a tank" category. Tons of fast-hitting attacks and big damage is the name of the game. In Endwalker, they basically handed them a few more attacks and said, "go get him, Tiger." But does that let it stand alongside the other tanks? I'd say it does more than that. Gunbreaker has been in an incredible spot since implementation, even if the busyness can definitely be a bit much. The job's basic combos, both single target and AoE, grant them cartridges up to a max of 3, which can then be spent on some skills. The 2 basics are Burst Strike and Faded Circle, single target and AoE attacks respectively. They also have Gnashing Fang, which kicks off a high damage 3-part combo that is synonymous with their identity. Finally is their new skill, Double Down, which uses 2 cartridges to deal massive AoE damage once every 2 minutes. Managing these for burst windows is essential, with Bloodfest also helping out. What does Bloodfest do, you might ask? Well, Bloodfest allows you to draw 3 cartridges instantly, so the number of bonus attacks it helps pull off during burst windows is very valuable. Now, these cartridges are only half of their main identity. The other half is their single skill Continuation. This off-global attack grants access to a number of bonus attacks during your Gnashing Fang combo, with each attack in that combo granting another use of Continuation. This ensures at minimum 6 button presses during each of your cartridge combos, not to mention any other offensive or defensive skills you may need to activate. Continuation even adds an off-global attack to Burst Strike nowadays, increasing the number of things you need to press during your burst windows by another button. Now, on top of all of that, they do have some other damaging skills. Sonic Break is a global cooldown attack that inflicts a damage over time once every 60 seconds. Bow Shock is an AoE off-global damage over time skill once a minute. Rough Divide is their gap closer with up to 2 charges, standard stuff. And Blasting Zone is an off-global, very high damage attack. Between all of these things, your 60 and 120 second burst windows get just so busy. They even have No Mercy, above with a 60 second cooldown that increases their damage dealt by 20%. Even with it lasting 20 seconds, Gunbreakers can't even fit all of their damage into this window comfortably in their 2-minute reopeners. It's just that busy. Fortunately, they do also tank bosses, and they have some skills to do that, believe it or not. For just themselves, Camouflage reduces their damage taken by 10% and increases their parry rate by 50% for a short time, and Nebula reduces their damage taken by 30%. The rest of their defensive skills can be used on themselves, allies, or the whole party at once. Heart of Light reduces the party's magic damage taken by 10%, and Aurora is a regen that you can place on yourself or an ally. It has 2 charges with a 60-second recharge time as well. Then comes Heart of Corundum. Similar to certain other tank skills, this effect grants the target, whether that be the Gunbreaker or target party member, a number of effects. It reduces damage taken for a short time, with this effect intensified for the first few seconds of the buff. It also grants the player Catharsis of Corundum, which will provide a burst of healing if the player falls below 50% health or automatically after 20 seconds of receiving the effect. Corundum even grants a small shield if the Gunbreaker themselves is under the effect of Brutal Shell, a small heal and shield that they get from the second weapon skill in their basic single target combo. Finally is their invuln skill, Super Bolide. This reduces the Gunbreaker's health to 1 and makes them impervious to most attacks for 10 seconds. It's basically Hallowed Ground, but you go to 1 HP, and that's all it is. There is sometimes a little bit of a bug where the delay between going to 1 health and becoming invincible can become noticeable, especially in higher pings, but that won't affect most people most of the time. It's just one of those things you just might notice if you play the job long enough. For pros and cons, it's going to sound a lot like Dark Knight. Pros, it's an adrenaline rush. There's tons of button to press. It's exciting. There's big damage, many endorphins, all that good stuff. It doesn't take away from its tanking capabilities either, so they're just fully capable jobs across the board. That's all there is to it. Now for the cons, the job's busyness really works against it at times. Much like with Dark Knight, using defensive skills or dealing with boss movement during burst windows becomes incredibly cumbersome if they unfortunately line up. This is especially important for Gunbreaker for a number of reasons. 1, continuation skills must be used before your next weapon skill is used, or the extra ability will be completely lost, so you really don't want that to happen. Another thing is that Gunbreaker's actual alignment for its skills changes drastically even with the smallest of skill speed changes, so you really can't afford any more variables like boss movement or mitigation if you want to have an optimal burst window. The really skilled Gunbreakers know how to work around this, but it can be a little bit clunky even for them, so for a newer player, you might just be able to relish in hitting really hard and push that aside if you really need to enjoy the job or need to play the job. Now their AoE raid mitt is also strictly magic focused, meaning any physical AoEs are a little more troublesome to mitigate. Not something major, like we said with Dark Knight, most room-wide AoEs are magical, but sometimes this comes into play. And while their sustain is pretty strong, it's not quite at the level of Warrior or even Paladin. It's not too far behind though, and Heart of Corundum has some really skilled ways to utilize its healing more effectively. Despite these cons, Gunbreaker is often a popular raid choice for people looking to deal lots of damage and keep busy. Now that we've covered all 4 tanks, I need to pick a winner, and it's honestly really tough. The tanks really do come down to whether or not you want something super busy or something that's a little easier to play. Maybe you prefer a certain job fantasy, and that's really all the preference that it comes down to. But despite all of that, I really do want to pick a winner. And so I think that I'm going to give the win to Warrior. Yeah, I really want to give it to one of the other jobs, but it's not just about the unga bunga big damage in a release. It's the most approachable tank. It's one of the most defensive tanks. It's the highest sustained tank, and I don't care if its damage is 3% or 2% or 4% behind another tank in certain encounters, and all the tanks are so close, so I should pick the highest DPS option. There's just so many pros to this job, and the cons are more preferential than any of the other ones. Could it be more exciting of a job to play? Absolutely. Will a longtime tank prefer something else? Probably, but I'm going to give Warrior the win on the merits that I've listed. Honestly, that just makes 2nd through 4th nearly impossible. Paladin is similar to Warrior in its DPS and has its own cons that make it kinda clunky. Then you have the other 2 tanks, Gunbreaker and Dark Knight, which their busyness, yeah, it can be exciting, but it can be such a nuisance when you're dealing with certain mechanics. So the cons are far more noticeable than Warrior. This kind of forces me to group them all up, or to decide to go in DPS order, in which case it would likely be Gunbreaker 2nd, Dark Knight 3rd, and Paladin 4th. But that just doesn't represent how the tank role works right now. It is just so close between them that you'll almost certainly see preference dictate choice and not meta. And that's how it should be for all the roles. The tank role just needs some revitalization from a gameplay perspective, not from a balance perspective. So if anything, I just have to give the other 3 tanks, 2, 3, and 4 all together, throw them in a pool and pick one out depending on which one you want to play. And with that, that's going to be a wrap for our Final Fantasy XIV Tank Versus. Thank you for being patient with this series. We've had so many other things going on the YouTube and Twitch channel, but I promised you I'd get you all of these, and I still plan to get them done before patch 6.2. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share, and I'll see you in the next video. Until then, take care.